Hey guys, welcome to the channel. In this video, we're going to talk about ressentiment. Now, ressentiment is a French word that Nietzsche used to basically define this idea of injury that a group tells themselves. Now, you can think of it like a persecution complex where one group blames all of their problems on another group that they perceive as more powerful and sort of oppressing them, but it's a little bit more broad than just the standard victim mentality that you often hear people talk about today. And actually, it was Kierkegaard who was the first to use the word ressentiment, but I think Nietzsche is the one who designed it in the usage we're going to be using today. Now, the following examples are coming from sociologist James Davison Hunter's excellent book, To Change the World, where he's basically equally harsh on both the conservative Christians and liberal Christians for embracing a ressentiment-based politic when it comes to their political engagement. So let me first talk about what ressentiment is, and maybe I'll give you a few examples as well. Ressentiment is basically grounded in a narrative of injury, or at least a perceived injury. It's a strong sense of belief that one has been or is being wronged. And the root of this is really a sense of entitlement that the group holds. So they may think, I deserve greater respect or greater influence or a better lot in life. And really, they assume that these benefits have been taken away, or will be taken away, or will be continued to be taken away by those who are in a position of power. But here, what's really important is that perception is what's key. It's not necessarily that you need to be victimized for ressentiment to work. It can certainly happen in true cases, but it doesn't necessarily need to be true. And actually, understanding yourself to be victimized isn't just a passive acknowledgement, but it can actually be cultivated by retelling these sort of accounts of atrocity and creating this narrative and sort of finding things to be mad about, reinforcing the sense that you have been wronged. And what this eventually ends up doing is motivating political action. It involves the condemnation and denigration of enemies, basically in an effort to subjugate and dominate those people think are culpable. Because really what happens is if you believe you have been victimized by some group who is bigger or the bully, you can actually justify taking that power back because you don't believe you need to be responsible in that particular way. You believe you've been harmed and things have been unfair, and people often use this to justify all sorts of even violent action against the group in question. So this is what David Brook says. He says, extremists in the parties, quote, tell themselves that their enemies are so vicious that they have to be vicious too. They rationalize their behavior by insisting that circumstances have forced them to shelve their integrity for the good of the country. They imagine that once they've achieved victory through pulverizing rhetoric, they will return to the moderate and nuanced sensibilities they think they still possess. But basically, as this demonstrates, that means determine ends. Hyper-partisans may have started with subtle beliefs, but their beliefs led them to partisanship, and their partisanship led to malice, and malice made them extremists, and pretty soon they were no longer the same people, end quote. So this is part of the reason Hunter is aiming at this is because he thinks everything has sort of become political, and this is why. He says, quote, given this turn, it is hardly surprising that the language of partisan politics has come to shape how we understand others. The identity of public actors is determined to a large degree by their partisan attachments, either real or presumed. This is not only seen in how we tend to label people and their actions and motivations ideologically as conservative, liberal, traditionalist, progressive, feminist, fundamentalist, and the like. Such labels discredit or credit depending on what the group one is in and their relationship that they have. And then even categories of identity that are not fundamentally political have become stuffed with political meaning. And Hunter says this is precisely what has happened to the categories of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. And he basically says, look, age and disability are evolving in this direction too. And this is how many people choose to understand themselves. Next to their occupation or profession, he says, quote, their commitments as Democrats, Republicans, pro-lifers or pro-choicers, conservative, liberal, gay, and so on, compete to form the largest part of a person's identity in public, end quote. So once again, remember that ressentiment is this narrative that one has been wronged in the past. And now let's turn our attention, and this is what Hunter does, to conservative Christians. So conservative Christians have this idea that they're being ignored or belittled and maybe even discriminated. Some conservative Christians argue that one can find within the news media, among Democratic politicians, and among left-wing interest groups and in the courts, outright, quote, anti-Christian bigotry, end quote. That, quote, the public expression and acknowledgement of religion and traditional values have been banned, end quote, and that their efforts to, quote, silence Christian voices and suppress the Christian vote, end quote, and that, quote, liberal culture has targeted our kids, end quote. Now, once again, it's difficult to identify whether or not this is real or not, but it doesn't really matter as long as the narrative is there. When it comes to progressive Christians, Hunter says, he cites this book by Randy Ballmer, like Kingdom Come, An Evangelical's Lament. Hunter's response to this is, quote, "This is a curious book, for it reflects most of the problems he attributes to the religious right. His disdain for the Christian right leads him to engage in name-calling, that it is as one-dimensional and dehumanizing as the most extreme voices of the Christian right, labeling his opponents, quote, right-wing zealots, end quote, and bullies, and their followers minions, who together are, quote, intolerant, vicious, militaristic, bloviating, and theocratic," end quote. So what Hunter is doing is saying, look, conservative Christians and progressive Christians both have this narrative of resentiment, and more that's how they are being used to define themselves, and perhaps less and less grounding themselves in actual reality. What's really interesting is to take this analysis and apply it to New Atheism as well. Notice how New Atheism tends to blame all of its problems on organized religion. It sees itself as oppressed by, I guess, religious institutions, or consider, for instance, Christopher Hitchens, who says, quote, "religion poisons everything," end quote, and the standard narrative that sort of religion and creationism is at fault for singly for a lack of trust in science. And there's this kind of narrative, right, that as soon as everyone's scientifically literate and we get rid of these superstitions of the past, we're all going to sing Kumbaya in a great circle and live in these futuristic cities. And if you want a great example, you can go to some of my comments on some of my videos, and you'll see some of the more fedora tipping type of atheists having these sort of resentiment-based comments as well. In all of these cases, right, whether it's progressive, conservative, Christian, or atheist, when people are telling themselves these sort of resentiment-based narratives, notice that there's almost this conspiracy theory-like nature to these claims. And what I would ask is it really true that all of the opponents in question, or that this group is really plotting or maliciously targeting people? And is it possible that we contribute to this when we justify our responses in either case, when we sort of use the fact that other people have done it to justify our own behavior? I think this is actually pretty problematic. Now, I think in all of these cases, there's probably some level of truth to these. The problem is, over time, these narratives can end up going farther and farther from reality when we don't temper them and don't realize, wait a minute, am I telling myself a story? Am I inventing things to get mad about? Or is this actually the way things are? Are things perhaps more nuanced than this simplistic narrative of, good guys versus bad guys in this particular context? Now, what's interesting for Christians, of course, is the way the gospel actually provides a solution to this resentiment-based politics if we actually choose to live our lives this way. So Jesus says to love your enemies, and we also need to make sure we're listening to one another and we're slow to anger, not as what Paul talks about in the New Testament, forming into little groups and thinking the other groups are wrong. I think some groups can be wrong, but we need to do this from a place of listening, of reflection and kindness and charity. How can we know we're not coming from this resentment-based place versus actually doing this? Well, I think one way is to really stop and think. And one of the things Hunter says is perhaps taking a season to just be silent and listen and engage with people on their own terms, rather than telling the story and engaging in this negative politic of really trying to control and dominate people. I think Christianity has an opportunity to be a refuge from the sort of nihilism of popular culture and the endless politicalization of pretty much every damn thing. I mean, if you think about it, gender, race, what books our children read, all of this stuff has become political, and I don't think it necessarily has to be, or I don't think we need to see ourselves as necessarily, we can of course vote and have our political attachments, but we don't need to lose ourselves in the process of doing this. And we certainly, in my view, shouldn't be using the behavior of other people to justify us doing similar behavior, because I don't think that's really solving anything. In fact, academia is not free from this either. And to the extent that current academics don't rise above these sorts of simplistic political myths, they're ending up undermining their own authority. And we're seeing this pretty much going on right now as we speak. So my advice is this, right? If you're a Christian, find a church that transcends all this crap. A church that's going to welcome both liberals and conservatives is probably a good sign. I would expect God's grace to transcend political affiliation. It's really not that narrow. And this doesn't mean you need to be neutral in your own political affiliation. I basically what I want to say is don't miss the forest for the trees here. I've learned a lot from my liberal and conservative friends, and I'm glad to see all those different perspectives. And God loves us regardless of our party affiliation, so we ought to love one another the same. I mean, that's what I would say. And I think this really does hopefully resonate with a lot of people. I think the difficulty is putting this into practice. And for me, sometimes that means is not being around the more extreme voices, both on the sides I do agree with, but also the sides I don't agree with. Because sometimes you can have reverse polarization, which is what happens when you see some meme from another group and it causes you to temper your own beliefs, but you start thinking the people who are posting all these memes or these other things are really more extreme than they actually are. And I think this is problematic because it keeps us from actually seeing reality. So let me know what you guys think. Definitely check out James Davison Hunter's book, To Change the World. It's a very, very insightful, very thought-provoking book. I would encourage it to everybody. It's a very interesting combination of like theology and social science and philosophy, mostly social science. I mean, he's a sociologist, but he has a lot of really interesting perspectives on all this stuff. And I think this idea of resentiment is very applicable to the way in which people see themselves and the way in which everything's sort of becoming polarized. I think part of the problem is due to media technology, but also part of it may just be due to people's either like lack of education or lack of feeling like they need to think things through and be respectful. I'm not really sure. Of course, we don't want to have resentiment against resentiment itself, but I think really what it comes down to is just trying to live our lives in accordance with our values that are healthy and not trying to demonize or denigrate others. So anyway, yeah, let me know what you think. Once again, it's totally fine to have your own political beliefs, but I think what's really important is to be able to argue those in a healthy and productive way and not resort to sort of name calling or trying to sort of subjugate or dominate other people without giving them a fair platform to speak their views and then you getting a fair platform to speak your own. So anyway, let me know what you think. Lots of really interesting stuff here in this resentiment-based theory and lots along with political myths. A lot of good sociologists at University of Virginia who have developed this theory as well. And I will see you in the next video.